It was supposed to be a routine patrol. The Syrian pilot in the MiG-23 had no radar contact, no threat indicators, no AWACS warning, just clear skies, and a fuel gauge ticking down. Then, without sound or warning, the cockpit exploded. Mid-turn, the aircraft vanished from the screen. No lock-on, no time to evade, just gone. When Soviet advisors reviewed the combat footage, they froze the frame at the moment of death. The contrail of the missile was faint, barely visible in the camera's grain. But the launch aircraft, not visible. No heat plume, no radar echo, no electronic emissions, no record of a dogfight, just a solitary MiG flying a patrol until it wasn't. The kill had come from over 50 miles away, beyond the range of visual detection, beyond the reach of Soviet missile counters, and far outside the design parameters of any MiG in the Soviet arsenal. And it wasn't a one-off. It kept happening. MiG-21s, MiG-23s, even the elusive MiG-25 shot down before they could lock targets or even identify them. And the ghost behind the trigger, the F-15 Eagle. Its radar could see before the MiGs could think. Its missiles could fire before the MiGs could blink. And its pilots never had to dogfight. In a war room outside Moscow, a Soviet aerospace engineer reviewed the wreckage reports. Missile debris, radar logs, voice recordings from Syrian squadrons repeating one chilling phrase: "We never saw them." For engineers who had spent decades building faster, stronger fighters, the implications were brutal. They had designed aircraft to survive close combat, but the Americans had killed that era. Now, it wasn't about maneuvering. It was about seeing. And the F-15 could see first. And in aerial warfare, he who sees first wins. Soviet engineers weren't careless. They were confident. And that confidence was forged in a furnace of real-world data, battlefield experience, and Cold War theory. By the late 1960s, the USSR had built a generation of fighters that matched or exceeded anything in the American arsenal on paper. The MiG-21 was a bullet with wings. The MiG-23 added radar-guided missiles and swing-wing versatility. The MiG-25 was a monster, blindingly fast. Radar-soaked, built to outrun and outclimb anything that flew. The design brief was simple: outfly, outclimb, outgun, and for years, it worked. In Vietnam, Soviet-built MiGs tangled with U.S. Phantoms and won more than expected. In the Middle East, Soviet advisors watched Egyptian and Syrian pilots score kills. Soviet engineers logged every victory as confirmation. Dogfights were still the coin of air superiority. Speed and missile range still ruled. Pilots still needed eyes. What they didn't realize, what they couldn't imagine, was that the Americans were building a weapon not for dogfighting, but for deletion. Soviet doctrine assumed every air-to-air kill would follow the same chain radar lock: visual ID, missile launch, evade or counter-evade. It was a system built on reaction. But the F-15 changed everything. It wasn't built to react. It was built to strike before the fight began. And the assumptions guiding MiG design, like radar parity, missile flight time, and human response windows, crumbled under that one reality: the eagle didn't wait to see its enemy. It killed without being seen. Yet Soviet engineers kept optimizing for outdated fights. They built bigger engines, sharper noses, longer IRST baselines. But they missed the truth hiding inside the F-15. It wasn't just a machine. It was the system sensors, fire control, and long-range kill doctrine woven into one aircraft that rendered visibility obsolete. While the USSR trained its pilots to outmaneuver, the U.S. trained theirs to terminate before merging. And when that doctrine was unleashed over the Bekaa Valley and the deserts of Iraq, Soviet engineers learned something they had never planned for. Your fighter is only as good as how far it can see, and their MiGs, they were blind. To the Soviet Air Force, aerial supremacy was geometry. Climb rate, turn radius, acceleration, missile, envelope, it was all math, and they believed they had solved the equation. The MiG-21 was designed to climb faster than its opponent. The MiG-23 was supposed to break missile locks with its swing-wing agility. The MiG-25 was an interceptor built for raw speed to rush headlong toward bombers and blast them from the sky at Mach 2.8. Every aircraft in the Soviet arsenal was forged in the belief that air combat would always happen within a few dozen kilometers, that pilots would see each other, react, and fight like gladiators fast, close and deadly. Their doctrine had a name: visual engagement first. Missiles were a tool, but the kill came when the pilot could see the enemy. Even their radar systems were optimized for that close-in picture, long on power, short on discrimination. They could paint a sky, but not isolate a target. Soviet designers saw radar as a guide, not a weapon, a flashlight for the pilot, not a sword. That's where the F-15 broke everything. Its pulse Doppler radar didn't just scan it hunted. It filtered out ground clutter, tracked through jamming, and could lock onto targets at 70-plus miles, long before a MiG's nose even pointed in the right direction. The Soviets had taught their pilots to dodge missiles with hard turns and flares. But the F-15 didn't fire from within eyesight. It launched from beyond the horizon. By the time the warning tone buzzed in the MiG cockpit, the missile was already closing at Mach 4. There was no room to maneuver, no visual contact, no fight, just detection and deletion. The F-15 made Soviet dogfight doctrine obsolete, and the terrifying part. This wasn't theory. It was happening in real time. MiG after MiG fell from the sky, never having seen the aircraft that killed them. For decades, Soviet doctrine preached that speed and maneuver would win the sky. But the F-15 didn't care how fast you could turn. It only cared whether it had seen you first, and if it had, the fight was already over. The moment it happened, Soviet advisors in Syria didn't believe the report. A MiG-23 had gone missing over the Bekaa Valley. No distress call, no radar warning, no wreckage found, just a blip that vanished mid-patrol. When the debrief came in, it was even stranger. The aircraft had been flying a high-speed racetrack pattern at 30,000 feet. No visual contact, no ECM interference. The radar had shown nothing approaching. Ground control had monitored a clean screen. Then came the CIA intercept, obtained later through Israeli channels, Fox 3. Splash 1. The timestamp matched the moment the MiG disappeared. What aircraft could kill without being seen? What weapon gave no warning? No chance to evade? The Americans had done something that shouldn't be possible. They had executed a long-range air-to-air kill without being detected at all. Back in Moscow, senior engineers at Mikoyan pored over the data. The MiG-23 should have had at least 20 seconds of radar warning. Its RWR should have lit up. It should have had time to maneuver, time to eject, time to fight. But the missile had come from beyond the MiG's radar horizon. The killer was never in range, never in sight. And when satellite intel confirmed the culprit, an Israeli F-15 using U.S.-made radar and Sparrow missiles, Soviet command went into denial. No aircraft can fire accurately at that distance. No radar can discriminate at that range. No missile can track from that angle. But the kill was real, and it wasn't an outlier. In the days that followed, the Bekaa Valley became a graveyard. F-15 scored dozens of kills, most without ever being seen. MiG-21s, 23s, even Foxbat interceptors burned in the sky, never having fired a shot. The impossible had become repeatable. And the engineers at Mikoyan began whispering what the generals refused to say. We built fighters for the wrong war. Their MiGs had speed, they had maneuver, they had endurance, but none of that mattered. Because in the new era of combat, those jets weren't warriors. They were targets. The reports arrived fast in raw translated field logs, intercepted radio calls, telemetry from Syrian radar sites, but the Soviet Air Force Command refused to accept them. The F-15 wasn't supposed to do this. According to official doctrine, no aircraft could execute multiple kills at long range without a visual, especially against variable speed, evasive targets like the MiG-23. The MiGs were designed for flexibility, raw thrust, climb rate, and rapid merge capability. That was the fight the Soviets had prepared for. Instead, the Americans were erasing fighters from the sky before that fight could even begin. But in Moscow, senior command clung to the comfort of denial. The Syrians were undertrained, the MiGs were misused, the kills were exaggerated. And then came the radar logs. Telemetry from Soviet-built early warning stations around the Bakaa Valley showed no hostile aircraft detected. The kill zone had been covered by 3 overlapping radar bands, and yet nothing. Dozens of MiGs destroyed. No radar contact, no visual sighting. To Soviet engineers who had poured years into radar systems, like the RP-22 and Sapphire-23, this was unacceptable. Their radars were supposed to see everything. If the MiGs couldn't detect the threat, it meant either one of 2 things. The Americans had developed a sensor capability far beyond Soviet understanding. Or worse, they had changed the engagement paradigm entirely. But the generals still refused to rewrite the doctrine. Instead, they blamed flawed tactics. They blamed command delays. They blamed Western exaggeration. Some even floated theories that Israel was using decoy drones or AWACS-assisted baiting techniques. Anything but the truth that the F-15 had turned the battlefield into one-sided murder. What they failed to understand, what they could not bring themselves to believe, was that the Eagle wasn't looking for a dogfight. It wasn't trying to tangle. It was trying to detect fire and vanish, and it was succeeding. Every day the denials piled up. So did the body count. Every excuse shattered on impact with another blackened MiG frame pulled from a crater. By the end of that summer, Soviet engineers had stopped laughing in the briefings. Some had started to ask quiet questions. What if we're wrong? What if we've been building for a war that no longer exists? The answers would come soon enough. And they wouldn't be theoretical. They would come at 40,000 feet. From an aircraft their radars never saw, and a missile their pilots never outran, with amounting losses and no radar contacts to explain them. Soviet air doctrine needed a scapegoat. It found one in a comfortable, convenient theory: the F-15 only wins because it cheats. The narrative spread fast among senior staff and design bureaus. The Americans, they said, weren't using the F-15 in isolation. These kills weren't proof of superiority, but evidence of overwhelming force coordination. The F-15s were simply triggermen operating with satellite support, airborne early warning, electronic jamming, and external targeting relays. In this theory, the F-15 was not the predator. It was a puppet, guided by AWACS, protected by jamming aircraft, and dependent on external command to feed at targets. Soviet engineers latched onto this idea. It made sense. It preserved the integrity of their designs. If true, then the MiGs had been defeated, not by a better aircraft, but by a stacked battlefield. They reran simulations with this model in mind. Remove AWACS, remove jamming, remove tanker support, and suddenly the F-15 looked beatable. Maybe even inferior in a one-on-one. But then came the hard data. Israeli combat logs from the Lebanon War, later leaked to Western intelligence and recompiled by CIA analysts, told a different story. Solo F-15s routinely executed kills without support aircraft. Engagements occurred without AWACS coordination, confirmed by signal intercepts. F-15 radars alone provided long-range detection and lock-on capability. Every kill was self-contained detect, track, fire, all from the cockpit. Further analysis revealed that the Eagle's AN/APG-63 radar could do what Soviet sets could not: track multiple targets at range, ignore ground clutter, cut through jamming, lock from above, below, or head on, and most dangerously, engage before the enemy's radar ever saw it. The truth was brutal. The F-15 was not a puppet. It was a lone hunter. The cheating theory collapsed in one paragraph of a U.S. pilot's debrief. We never needed AWACS to make the kill. We saw the MiG on our radar, locked him up, launched the Sparrow, and watched him disappear. No external coordination, no jamming cover, just a single aircraft executing a one-sided kill. Soviet engineers read the transcripts in silence. The Americans weren't just flying a better fighter. They were flying a platform so integrated, so autonomous, and so lethal that Soviet doctrine couldn't even categorize it properly. It wasn't an interceptor, it wasn't a bomber, it wasn't even a fighter in the old sense. It was something new, an airborne sniper, and the MiGs. They were still looking through a scope made of glass, while the Eagle watched them through the fog of war clear as day. After dismissing the idea that the F-15 was fighting solo, Soviet strategists clung to one last illusion. The MiGs were outnumbered. That's all. This theory painted the air battles as unfair, not because of technology, but because of scale. According to Moscow's interpretation, the F-15s didn't win with quality. They simply arrived in greater numbers. With superior positioning and force ratios the MiGs couldn't match. Of course they won, said one Soviet colonel in a closed-door session. A single MiG facing 4 F-15s is not combat. It's execution. It was a theory that gave engineers hope. Because if the defeats were only due to outnumbering, then the MiG was still a worthy design. If future fights were even, parity would be restored. But this theory shattered even faster than the first. Declassified Israeli and U.S. Air Force combat logs cross-referenced with AWACS and ground station data revealed a stunning pattern in nearly 60% of the confirmed F-15 kills against MiGs. The Eagle was alone, not part of a formation, not escorted, not receiving overlapping support. Just one jet, one radar, one kill, and in some cases, multiple kills. One particularly devastating sortie during Operation Peace for Galilee saw a solo Israeli F-15 shoot down 3 MiG-21s in 4 minutes. The MiGs never coordinated, never returned fire, and never locked on. It wasn't a numbers game. It was a sight game. The Eagle saw first, fired first, and left before the MiGs knew what hit them. Soviet MiG-23s, even with their swing wings and acceleration, couldn't break lock. Their radars weren't powerful enough. Their missiles couldn't match the reach. Their warning receivers failed to alert in time. In a cold report that reached the Kremlin in late 1982, a Soviet advisor summed up the nightmare. The MiGs are dying in isolation, not because they're few, but because they are blind and alone. The myth of numerical disadvantage gave way to a harsher reality. The MiGs weren't outnumbered. They were outclassed. By the mid-'80s, even Warsaw Pact allies began requesting F-15 engagement simulations. East German officers whispered that in the event of war, they'd never reach the merge. Polish planners quietly updated kill probability charts, and MiGs lost every time. Still, Soviet generals refused to accept it publicly, because if one Eagle could eliminate multiple MiGs from beyond visual range, then the entire balance of power wasn't tilted. It was shattered. Soviet intelligence had a reputation for surgical theft. Blueprints, circuit boards, cockpit layouts the KGB and GRU had stolen them all before. They'd cloned the B-29, replicated the space shuttle, reverse-engineered Western avionics down to the last transistor. But the F-15 was different. From the moment it entered service in 1976, the Eagle eluded Soviet technical penetration. There were rumors, photos, unverified specs, but nothing solid. The radar a mystery. The missile interface unknown. Even the cockpit displays remained blacked out in every known image. The GRU launched an all-hands effort to break the wall. Agents were dispatched to air shows. Informants were recruited in the U.S. defense industry. Bait operations tried to lure engineers into defecting. Nothing worked. Unlike previous American fighters, the F-15 had been developed under a compartmentalized, tight-loop doctrine. McDonnell Douglas kept the supply chain narrow. Radar integration and weapons testing occurred inside isolated, access-controlled zones. And the U.S. had learned from past mistakes. Every critical component of the Eagle was secured as if it were a nuclear asset. Even the radar, the AN/APG-63, was locked behind electronic encryption, internal obfuscation, and counter-tamper fail-safes. Its look-down, shoot-down algorithms were never written down in a single place. The signal processing chain was fragmented across firmware, analog circuits, and internal code, which changed from unit to unit. The Soviets could photograph the jet, they could measure the nose cone, but they couldn't steal the soul of the system. Desperate. The KGB turned to pilots. They paid defectors, intercepted training materials, and tried to reconstruct radar behavior from second-hand descriptions. But the kill records didn't lie. MiGs were being shot down at distances Soviet models couldn't detect. AM-7 missiles were hitting without radar guidance drops. F-15s were operating without jamming support, and winning. The more they investigated, the more disturbing the pattern became. The Americans hadn't just built a better radar. They'd built a fighter that turned data into lethal timing, a platform where every sensor fed the pilot a clear, first-shot, first-kill window optimized for missile delivery, not maneuver. One Soviet analysis from 1985 marked top secret. Put it bluntly, we have fighters, they have weaponized awareness. The difference was catastrophic, because Soviet fighters had to fight to see. The F-15 saw, then decided whether to fight, and by the time the MiG pilot realized what was happening, the Eagle had already made the decision. The missile was already in the air. The cold truth Soviet spies didn't fail to steal the F-15 secrets. The Americans had designed a system that couldn't be stolen, and on the battlefield. That meant the MiGs died, not from inferior design, but from invisible knowledge. The F-15 Eagle was not merely a fighter jet. It was the flying embodiment of a doctrine the Soviet Union had never fully understood: dominance through first sight, first strike, and total information control. Unlike Soviet aircraft designed around centralized command, ground control vectors, and brute speed, the F-15 was forged in a system that prioritized pilot autonomy, sensor fusion, and mission flexibility: its radar. The AN/APG-63 was not just a tracker. It was a hunter, capable of look-down, shoot-down targeting, multi-track scans, and target discrimination even in ground clutter. It allowed the pilot to act not as a pawn in a radar network, but as a sniper with wings. The entire platform was designed around one goal: kill before being seen. Everything served this function. Twin engines with thrust-to-weight ratio exceeding 1.0, allowing vertical climbs and sustained turns. A bubble canopy giving full 360-degree visibility, integrated radar warning receivers, and threat prioritization algorithms. A cockpit that placed weapons, radar, and flight control at the pilot's fingertips. Long-range missiles, AIM-7 Sparrow and later AIM-120 AMRAAM, that could lock and fire before merge. But it wasn't just hardware. It was how the system was used. U.S. pilots were trained to think in time, not space. They didn't wait for the merge. They were drilled to scan, acquire, fire, and leave all before the enemy knew a fight had started. Soviet air combat still lived in the world of reaction. The Eagle lived in the world of preemption. The MiG-23 had to climb, maneuver, and burn fuel just to survive an encounter. The F-15 had already scored the kill before the MiG left its assigned altitude. It wasn't a fair fight. It was a different dimension of warfare, and it was scalable. The F-15 wasn't a one-off miracle. It was the cornerstone of a broader American air dominance architecture. AWACS extended radar eyes hundreds of kilometers. Tanker fleets gave F-15s global legs. E-2 Hawkeye and J-Stars delivered battlefield-wide tactical intelligence. Satellite support ensured navigation and early warning. Every American F-15 wasn't just a fighter. It was a node in a kill web. Each unit empowered to act with precision and autonomy. And in that web, the MiG had no place. It was a machine built for a fight that no longer existed. One where pilots searched the skies with their eyes. But the Eagle didn't search. It already knew. And when the time came to strike, it did so with impunity. This was the true American system. Not about matching numbers, not about raw speed, but about building a machine that made every enemy fighter obsolete the moment it entered radar range. The moment of reckoning came in 1991. Operation Desert Storm would not just test the F-15, it would define it. Iraq's Air Force was one of the most heavily armed outside the Warsaw Pact, equipped with Soviet-built MiG-21s, MiG-23s, MiG-25s, and the vaunted MiG-29 Fulcrum. Saddam's pilots had trained under Soviet advisors, flown Soviet doctrine, and trusted Soviet hardware. And yet, the F-15 went to war and came back untouched. In the opening hours of the campaign, U.S. F-15C Eagles patrolled the skies like sentinels. They were alone, high, fast, and silent. Iraqi MiGs scrambled, but they never saw what hit them. A MiG-29 was destroyed by an AIM-7 before crossing the border. 2 MiG-25s tried to engage. They were gone in 90 seconds. A MiG-23 banked into a climb only to vanish in a white flash at 40 miles. In all, F-15Cs scored 36 air-to-air kills during Desert Storm. Every one of them against Soviet-designed aircraft. Every one of them without a single Eagle loss. The final kill ratio, 36-0. It was a massacre, and Soviet engineers were forced to watch their creations burn on global television. No less. Footage showed MiGs plunging into the desert. IR videos captured radar locks from miles out. Pilots debriefed on how they never had to dogfight, how the MiGs never even maneuvered. One American pilot later said, "We saw them pop up, fired, splash. They never broke lock. In Moscow, the humiliation was total. They had spent decades designing fighters to counter the F-4 Phantom, only to be leapfrogged by a generation. The MiG-25 was once feared. Now it was a high-speed coffin. The MiG-29 meant to rival the F-15 was shot down before its radar could even engage. And worst of all, the F-15 didn't even bring its full arsenal. No stealth, no AMRAAM, no need. It killed with what it had in the 1970s. That single fact shattered Soviet confidence. If their best export fighters couldn't survive the 1976 version of the Eagle, what chance did they have against what came next? Soviet engineers were silenced, their data invalidated. Generals blamed poor training. Analysts blamed Iraqis. But in private, behind closed doors, they admitted it. We built fast planes. They built air dominance. And Desert Storm didn't just bury Saddam's Air Force. It buried an era of Soviet aerospace pride. The numbers couldn't be hidden. In NATO war rooms and Soviet intelligence briefings, the same data repeated the F-15 was not just surviving, it was dominating. And worse, it was doing so with weapons and radar technology the Soviets still didn't fully understand. After Desert Storm, the reckoning inside Soviet aerospace circles was brutal. The MiG-29, once touted as the equal of the F-15, had been defeated without ever getting a shot off. The MiG-25s, those screaming interceptors, once feared for their speed, were reduced to burning wrecks long before their pilots could even light afterburners. And the MiG-23, the workhorse of Warsaw Pact air forces, had become a symbol of helplessness. What was supposed to be a parody of power had been exposed as an illusion. The Soviet Union had built a doctrine based on quantity, not clarity, on intercepting massed bombers with fast climbers, on saturating the skies with radars, on pilot reaction times and post-merge maneuvering. But the Americans had skipped that chapter. They had built a doctrine on first detection and electronic dominance on shooting before the enemy ever appeared on a scope. The realization spread like a virus inside Soviet academia. Aerospace engineers who once boasted of performance curves now whispered about radar cross-sections, guidance algorithms, and lock time margins. Design bureaus that once emphasized engine thrust and G-limit envelopes now scrambled to figure out how the F-15's radar killed before seen. Strategically, this collapse had devastating implications. The USSR's entire export credibility for air defense systems was now suspect. Dozens of allies with Soviet hardware suddenly doubted their own survivability. Warsaw Pact nations began back-channeling requests for Western air combat doctrine. And ideologically, the blow went deeper, because this wasn't just a failure of aircraft design. It was a failure of belief. The belief that man could outfly machine, the belief that faster always meant deadlier, the belief that a pilot's instincts could overcome a longer-range radar and smarter missile. Soviet engineers had assumed war would happen close, visible, reactive. The F-15 had proven that war would happen far, invisible, and already over before the other side even knew they were in combat. By the time MiG pilots got radar contact, they were just seconds from impact. The collapse wasn't on the battlefield. It was in the classroom, the lab, the war doctrine itself, and it left behind a haunting lesson. The Americans hadn't built a better fighter. They had built a new kind of war. Today, the F-15 still flies. More than 45 years after its first mission, it remains undefeated in air-to-air combat. Over 100 confirmed kills, 0 losses, 0. A statistic so absolute, so final, it reads like myth. But to Soviet engineers, it was no myth. It was a scar. Because what the F-15 destroyed wasn't just MiGs. It was a mindset, an entire framework of warfare built on speed, maneuver, and reaction erased by a single jet with a long-range radar and the ability to fire first. The MiGs that fell never stood a chance. Not because they were badly built, not because they weren't brave, but because the war they were built for was already over. The Eagle never gave them a fight. It gave them a flash, a tone, a missile they never saw. And then silence. In old Soviet design offices, retired engineers speak of the F-15 with a mix of bitterness and awe. Some call it a cheater, others call it a ghost, but all agree it changed everything. Because it proved that dominance doesn't come from brute force. It comes from knowing before the other side even acts. That's what made the F-15 the ghost of the Cold War. It wasn't just faster. It wasn't just smarter. It ended fights that never began. And in every radar screen that flickered too late, in every warning light that blinked as the jet exploded, in every black box recovered from a downed MiG, the ghost whispered the same cold truth I saw you. You never saw me.